Over the next few weeks I shall be talking to Captain Harald Hartman Dahlmann. Now, Harald Dahlmann was born in 1942. He was born near the River Ruhr Valley in a small village in Germany. His grandfather and father before him were both pilots in the First and Second World War in the Luftwaffe. Harald, when he was 10 years old, took his first flying trip in a small glider that was built by his father and his uncle, and it was then that he knew that aviation was in his blood. The story is compelling of his experiences, his knowledge, and what he went through to become a pilot, to fly the F-104 Starfighter in Germany and in America, and go on to achieve many, many other accolades. I'll be talking to him over the next few weeks, and I invite you to watch this with me because it's so fascinating. So, Harald, welcome to our little show. We've been talking about this for years because we've been long time friends, as you know, and we've been working on a way how we can sort of present it and document it and so on. And this is our first of episode 1, if you like. But I know that actually what you want to do, you want to dedicate this to a very dear colleague of yours.
Yeah. I've been thinking about this. It's the first time, by the way, that I give an interview about what I have been doing in aviation. And yes, I would like to dedicate this interview to an good old friend of mine. His name is Gary Fisk, a honorary student of the American Air Force Academy. My roommate and a good friend who did not survive the first 30 hours of our common training. And it has been 60 years ago now, but I never forgot him.
Well, that's a wonderful dedication to make after such a career in aviation. And I know that during your military period and your early years you lost a lot of colleagues, and when you went into civil aviation you lost equally a lot of colleagues, because those were the earlier days of the 747s and the 737s and so on. So to dedicate that, I think that's a wonderful tribute, and I'm sure that the family will be very pleased to hear that. So let's go back to when you were a young boy. Let's talk about your grandfather and your father during them. What do you remember?
Well, born in 1942, there was quite a few years after the First World War, and it was getting to the end of the Second World War. I'm coming from an aristocratic family, and our great-great-grandfather was a general in the Swedish army who came to Germany. At that time it was not Germany, of course, with the Swedish king. That was during the 30-year civil and religious war in Europe, especially in Germany. The grandfather was part of the cavalry during and before the First World War, and was recruited, like many other people out of the cavalry, to get airborne. They started up in a Ballon Catif. That was a tethered balloon that was reached about an altitude of 300-400 feet.
Yes, and very dangerous they were, weren't they?
Yes.
We have some pictures of them here. Yeah.
We do, right. Yeah. Well, from there they were overseeing the enemy lines, and then you give the information down to the artillery. That was in the early days of the First World War. Later on, they went into lighter than air aircraft. The first one that they were using, not only them, the British and the Italians too, was the so-called Zeppelin.
Yes.
you know, with the basket underneath, and they
yes.
were sitting in the basket and dropping the bombs over enemy lines, picking them up out of the basket by hand, and then dropping them. They very quickly found out that these type of warfare was very vulnerable. You could shoot down a Zeppelin with one good bullet. I remember one thing during those days: they didn't have parachutes, neither in the balloon captives nor in the Zeppelins. In the 1960s, the first propeller-driven aircraft arrived in the war, and they were prepared for war. It was double-deckers, like he was flying the Fokker D-7, and some of them were with two people in there. The guy in the back seat was shooting at the enemies up there in the air with a gun, with a handgun or with a rifle. Later on they installed it on the wings, and that's how he survived the First World War. Again, these people didn't have any parachute. Now, if they were shot down or the engine quit on them, they had to stick with whatever they were sitting in. And that way he survived the First World War. And yeah, his son was my father.
Your father,
was my
yes.
grandfather. Remember one thing, we will have to tell the people, after the First World War ended, the Germans were not allowed, it was part of the peace treaty, to build aircraft, powered aircraft. So the Germans concentrated on gliders. So they were allowed to of course, to build gliders. Later on, in the 30s, in the late 20s and 30s, the Germans went to work together with the Russians. They built aircraft and trained on aircraft in Russia. Yes. To keep that away from,
and then turned them
the
against them. Turned them against them.
That's
later
right.
on. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is when my father was recruited, and his brother and some of their relatives. Many of them went into the Navy, but we are talking about the Air Force.
Mm-hmm. But just sorry to interject at that point. You share a name, the name Hartman,
Yes.
with a very, very famous pilot,
Yes, yes.
who was Eric Hartman,
Yes.
and that's
Eric,
in your family name.
Hartman was a big ace during the Second World War, and I think we come to this later on.
We will talk about
yes,
it. Yes,
we come to this later on. Now they have been training in Russia till Hitler got into power, and then nobody was caring about the peace treaty of 1918. So he stayed in the Air Force. His brother, as a gliding pilot, also was recruited, and many others. And they flew quite a few aircraft of the German Air Force later on. And when Hitler started to bring up the German armed forces, of course, they all trained on bombers that they intended to use during the coming Second World War. He ended up on the Heinkel HE 111 and ended up in Africa.
Serving under Rommel.
With General Rommel until they were driven out by the British and the Americans,
yes.
and he returned to...
And your father, he was in command of the Heinkel HE-111 aircraft. He was flying bombing missions into London and into Coventry later on, and he also was involved in an attempted mission to blow up the Tower, Tower Bridge,
yes.
Which was a failed attempt. We can be pleased to report.
We talked about it.
And further than that, he was on another mission when he got shot down across the channel.
Yes.
And got picked up by some fishermen. Tell us.
I don't know why they wanted to bomb Tower Bridge. It was of no tactical or strategic advantage to the German Air Force. Probably just to make too angry the British.
Probably.
Most probably, yeah. By the way, they did not. They did not succeed to do this, and later on one of the bombing missions across the channel, he was shot down and rescued out of the channel, which is not very wide, it's only 17 kilometers wide, by the Brits, and then with many other German Air Force pilots was sent to Canada. He was in a prisoner of war camp in Canada.
Which is where the majority of pilots served their time.
For whatever reason, they sent them to Canada.
There must have been a reason, I'm sure,
Yeah. I don't know what the reason was.
So when he returned?
He returned in 49 or 50, I'm not that sure. I was just an 8-year-old boy, a schoolboy. I hadn't seen him for quite some time, of course. And they took care of his family and his business in Germany and the big farm that we are coming from in northern Germany. That was the time when I was growing up and did a lot of sports. It was a time when I first introduced to an aircraft, a glider that we used to fly in Hartman. It's a small city in the northern part of the Ruhr Valley. And this is always a story, or many stories of a pilot. At that time, I thought that would be something I would like to do for the rest of my life. And later on followed up with this.
Yes, but it was against the wishes of your father, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. My father and his brother built this glider. It's only a 4 or 5 minute flight that you did, because you weren't getting very high. You were pulled by a big, huge rubber band, metal and rubber band, up to maybe 150, 200 feet high, going downhill, and then fly it in traffic pattern, a rectangular traffic pattern, and land again.
And when you were during your schooling period, of course, you were very keen on sports and fitness, and judo was the sport that you took up most keenly, and became virtually a national champion.
Yes, not the national champion. I was number 2, but I was in the national championships, and that was in 1956 or 57. I'm not that sure. Anyway, they sent us to the dojo Kodokan. It's a judo university in
Japan.
Yes, in Tokyo. And we stayed there during the school holidays, about 6 weeks, and came back very proud, and now with a bigger knowledge of what judo was.
Yeah, and that I imagine probably prepared you for the most important parts of the first stages of your career.
That's correct. That's correct.
In being a pilot.
When I finished high school, I applied for being a paratrooper, and in South Germany. At that time, the school was run by Americans. That was in the 1960s. And the bodily fitness helped me a lot to do this. Yeah. Until about half a year later, I was almost finished with the training. When the call came from the German Air Force that they were looking for apprentice pilots, young pilots, to be trained within the Air Force and trained in the United States.
But before this, you had to join the Einkaufskaffer, which was the elite paratroop regiment.
Yes, the regiment was in Altenstadt in southern Germany.
And that was at the age of 18?
Yes.
Yeah.
I had altogether maybe 25, 30 jumps.
Yes.
I don't know, some were at night, somewhere over the lake. You would land in the water, and but it was not something I intended to do for a lifetime. I wanted to fly. You know. So whenever the call came, I was first in the line to say, "Here I am, check me." And I want to do it.
And that was quite an interesting time, wasn't it? Because you put your hand up and and applied for the position,
yes.
Of which you were one of 500 of that first group of applicants.
That's right. They collected, from what I was told, I only saw maybe 20 or 30 people during the screening. That was in Hanover, and was about 1 week screening. Academic screening, physical screening, like we used to go into a centrifuge. We used to go into an altitude chamber, and
you then began a training regime in Utersen, wasn't it?
Yes. After the screening was over. Out of those 500 people, they finally decided to train 24 young pilots, or young want-to-be pilots, in Utersen. It's a little grass runway, and north of Hamburg. And we went through the initial piloted screening there, which consists again of academics for a few months, English language.
And that's when you first flew an aeroplane, wasn't it?
That is the first time that I not only saw, but was put into a powered aircraft. It was a Piper L-18,
yes,
a yellow one. You can see it on the. I think you've got a picture of it.
I have a picture of it.
Of that. Yeah. We were put. It was a tail dragger, so we were put into the front seat. On the back seat was an old Air Force gun as a trainer, and all we did with it is we practiced a rectangular traffic pattern, because they wanted to see, first of all, whether we got airsick. Some of them did, right on the first flight, and then were able to learn quickly, retrieve what we have learned, and fly this aircraft solo on a rectangular traffic pattern with less than 10 hours. So of these 24 guys, by the end of the day, 8 guys were left over.
And you were one of them.
Yes, I was. I was one of them. Yeah. And I still have the tie that they cut off when I did my first flight. It was a very tough flight. First of all, in this tail dragger, you couldn't see across the nose, because the nose was sticking up. You only saw the propeller. Yeah. It was totally unusual for somebody that had never been sitting in an aircraft.
Taking off and landing blind, virtually.
Yes, after more or less. Well, the approach was okay. You could see, of course, the grass from there. It was during the winter and heavy snow all over the place. Nowadays, you don't have any more snow in January, right? But it was heavy snow. And after the first couple of landings with the instructor, he kicked me out of the aircraft, and in this thick winter overall that we were wearing, I had to do 20 push-ups, and then he pulled me back into the aircraft and said, "Do it again, but this time better." It was a tough 10 hours that we had to be flying.
But your judo training kicked in, I'm sure, at that time, and that's fantastic. So now you're in the situation where you now know that you're the one of 8, and I know also that you scored the highest marks in all of your class categories, and continue to go on and do that through your career. I know that I know. But you were at Utersen. You had the privilege, I would say, of meeting and being addressed by Sir Arthur Harris, who was better known as Bomber Harris during the Second World War.
Yes.
And if my research is correct, I believe that Sir Arthur Harris spent time outside of the UK shortly after the war. It may well have been in South Africa, but at the same around some 10 years later, came back and then started touring Germany and parts of Europe. And he was in Uetersen addressing as part of the NATO.
Yes, yes. I consider this as an historical privilege. It was in the beginning of the 60s when he was touring German air bases. And it so happened that before we went into the States, after our screening training, we were invited to the base commander, who felt honored to, and we had a discussion with Air Marshal General Harris. Of course, the question was brought up: what did you do in Dresden? You know, remember Dresden happened about 3 months before Truman had the bombs, the atomic bombs. Thrown on these two
Hiroshima
and Nagasaki, those two Japanese things. And he used this analogy. He said that he had something similar in mind, that if they would bomb Dresden and Magdeburg, but mainly Dresden, by the way, you know, it was 2 days and it was 1,400 Allied bombers. They threw, I don't know how many, 10,000 kilograms of bomb.
Incendiary devices.
Only on Dresden. That was in February or March 1945. And a few months later, Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened. And I understood the analogy that he was making. He thought that if they hit a city like Dresden, the German front line soldiers would quit, you know, throw the weapons away and say, you know, if they bomb in our home country, our families, what are we doing here at the Russian front and you know, beating up the Russians? It didn't happen. Later on, it happened that 2 days after they threw the Nagasaki bomb, the Japanese quit. It was a very interesting, about 2 hours discussion with Harris, and I will never forget it. It's 60 years ago.
Yes, a very important part of history between. So now you're in the situation where you now know that you're the one of 8, and I know also that you scored the highest marks in all of your class categories, and continue to go on and do that through your career. I know that I know, but you're now waiting for your next instructions.
Well, I called up Mom and said, "Mom, I'm coming home, and not staying very long, maybe a week or maybe 10 days, and pack a few little things that I have at home, and then leave you, and I come back after 3 years." So
because you're off to America.
I'll be off to America. I sold my bike. I had a BMW, a 500cc BMW, and I had a little Fiat 100 Neckar car.
Yeah, I have a picture of that.
You have a picture of that. The BMW you don't have. It's an old BMW with a drive shaft. This typical BMW Boxer motor, right?
Yeah.
A 2-cylinder. Yeah, and it didn't take long in Uetersen till we were ready, got our sea sacks packed, and we were shipped to Hamburg to fly into the United States.
That's right, and that was quite an exciting time for you, because there were 4 of you. You were the spokesperson for the group of 4. You're all in your winter kit, as it were, because it was freezing cold in Hamburg.
Minus 5, 6, 7 degrees.
Right. And you're now going to take a flight in a Constellation.
The Super Constellation.
The Super Constellation, which is a 4-engine aeroplane, and you're going to be going to New York via Reykjavik.
Yes, I have to correct you, Kevin. It was a Super Constellation, a 4-engine. We used to call it, or they used to call it, the best 3-engine crossing Atlantic aircraft.
Yes, yes.
Of these times, because quite often they lost an engine and kept on, of course, flying a little bit longer, a little bit lower, with a little bit less fuel use. And yes, we flew with the Super Constellation via Iceland, Reykjavik to New York. And it was an 18-hour flight altogether.
But like a perfect gentleman, you bought the flowers for the cabin crew.
Remember one thing. Never ever anybody of us had been even close to a Lufthansa aircraft, much less inside, much less had seen a Lufthansa crew, right? So the girls were, of course, in uniform. They were wearing white gloves, and I mean, that was in the 1960s. There was not a 747 Super Jumbo with 500 people in there. What we did is we bought on the Hamburg airport, we bought a big bunch of flowers, and I presented the flowers to the chief of cabin, and we were all proud now to be part of the passenger crew that were flying to New York. Not many people in these days, maybe 35 or 40 people on board.
Yes.
Yes, and we were invited into the cockpit, of course, and that's the first time I saw a cockpit with all these, I didn't count them, unbelievable instruments. With the cockpit at those times, they had 5 people in there. There was the captain, the first officer, then the flight engineer, there was an extra flight engineer, then there was a navigator, and somebody that did the communication.
Radio officer,
yes. And
so it was quite a busy little flight deck. Actually, I've got a picture of it here. Now it's. And
I thought to myself, oh my God, no, I can never handle something like this. Jesus Christ! Look at how many instruments are in my Fiat. I had 2 instruments.
A fuel gauge and a mileometer. Yeah.
We didn't know what was coming.
Yeah.
But we took care of this later on.
That's fantastic. So you arrive in New York.
Yeah. New York, of course, at that time, the latitude is like Madrid in Spain, like southern Europe.
Yes.
So the temperature was, there was no winter temperature at that time, close to 20 degrees plus, I think. We couldn't believe that these type of temperatures would happen during January. And we had our winter uniforms. Now, luckily, we went into a hotel there and could dress down. But the next day, we used to be in our uniforms again and go from New York with an American airliner to San Antonio, Texas. It was called Lakeland Air Force Base, one of the biggest bases in the United States.
And that Lakeland, and still to this day, I think, is the great base where they have training people from all over the world.
Yes, that is
training for different, not necessarily for aircraft or
no, it's not a pilotry training base. No,
it's a military training base.
Yes, there was about 50,000-60,000 people from the Philippines, from Korea, from the Middle East, from I don't know from where they all came there and training. And us, we were a group for ourselves, of course, and the main thing was to teach us the English American language. Now, with our school English, you don't get very far in the States.
Of course.
So, of course, and of course we had sports every day, a lot of sports. We were introduced to American sports, football, American football.
Of course.
Not European, but the European would wrongly call football. American football. I never played golf, and they put a golf bat into my hand and taught me how to play golf.
But you said no, you want to carry on with your judo training.
And I did judo.
Yes,
because of course there was a mat. They had a dojo there, And I kept judo all of my training, 3-year training period. Even when I got back later on, I did judo in Cologne. There was a judo club in Cologne. Yes. That was about 3 months. And I want to mention one thing. This Lakeland Air Force Base, there's 4 Air Force bases around San Antonio. Lakeland Air Force is the biggest one. There was no busing and things like this. So what the Germans did, the German Air Force did, they gave everybody of us $800 and told us to buy an American car.
I know. And there's something special about that American car, isn't there? And what we're going to do, Harald, we're going to take a break now. In part 2, we're going to come back and we're going to talk about the great American car that Harald and his buddy Hans actually went off and bought, and then they did a tour around America. Join us for part 2.
Okay. We will start in San Antonio.